Geothermal has been historically accepted by the public and governments as a clean and green energy source, and as a result, it is uncommon for stakeholders to lobby against geothermal developments in their communities. Generally, geothermal development has taken place at local and regional scales, pursued by local entities who are known and trusted by the communities in which they operate. This trust and respect for geothermal by stakeholders is referred to as social license. So, what would happen if geothermal development quickly scales and the entities developing the resources are no longer small and locally known, but are instead multinational oil and gas companies? What can we learn from public opposition to fracking about how to assure geothermal retains its social license to operate? What can oil and gas companies do to create trust in communities where they intend to pursue geothermal development? Let's explore.
I ngā iwi, i ngā mana, ka huri ngā mihi ki a koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei kōrero. Hello everyone out there in Zoom land. My name is Andy Blair and I'm the president of the International Geothermal Association and co-founder of Upflow, a geothermal research consultancy and innovation company based in New Zealand. Today, we are discussing what I believe may be the single most widespread and important issue facing our industry. Without it, we cannot develop, operate, or grow. That is social license. The conversation will center around how to achieve social license, that is acceptance and ongoing community and local support for geothermal projects. With greater numbers of oil and gas businesses focused on geothermal projects. I'd now like to invite my panelists to introduce themselves. Allyson.
Hi, I'm Allyson-Anderson Book. I'm Vice President for Energy Transition at Baker Hughes. I lead, as the name sounds, I lead our energy transition kinds of activities, but specifically I do really focus in on our net zero and sustainability journey for the company.
Thanks, Allyson. And over to you, Neil.
Well, good day, everybody. My name is Neil Maddison. I'm the head of operations at the Conservation Foundation in London. My area of expertise really is working with local communities when they are involved with things like development and big projects around them. So I'm really interested to get questions and to get other people's perceptions of what's been going on in the world out there of geothermal.
Thanks, Neil. And over to you, Laurent.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Laurent. I'm Deputy Scientific Director in charge of Industrial Relations, Innovation and Valorization at the Earth and Universe Science Institute at CNRS, which is the National Center for Scientific Research in France. And I am coordinating the GEFIS project, which stands for Social Governance for Subsurface Engineering Projects, aiming at developing innovative stakeholder engagement practices.
Thank you. And over to you, finally, Bruce.
Hi, everybody. And I'm Bruce Hill, and I'm a geologist with a nonprofit organization based in Boston, Massachusetts, called Clean Air Task Force. We're a small group, nonprofit. We have people working in EU, China, South America, and Africa. There's about 60 of us, scientists, engineers, and lawyers. And we're a non-traditional, let's say technology-based, sometimes counter to environmental groupthink. We have major efforts in carbon capture, zero carbon fuels, nuclear, and so forth. I've been with them for about 21 years, and my focus over the years has been carbon sequestration and best practices in unconventional shale development. As far as geothermal, we're just starting to get into this space, really interested in supercritical systems, and we're one of the only NGOs in this space at the moment.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And as you can see, we've got a mixed group of people here, so the conversation should be interesting. So what's going to happen is we're going to have some questions between ourselves, and then we're going to invite you all who are watching to add some questions, and hopefully we'll get to answer those towards the end of the session. So I'm going to kick off a discussion with our panelists. And let's begin. So first of all, I'd like to invite you, Laurent, to talk about what is social license and why does geothermal have it?
Thanks, Andy. In fact, yeah, I'd like first to discuss a little bit the concept itself. Social license or social license to operate emerged with the critique of social acceptability. So indeed, social acceptability is often understood as an attempt to implement an already predefined industrial project. And as such, it has been criticized and opposed because simply conceived as of a project without prejudging its completion. Social license to operate is not exempt from ambiguities either. It remains a company-centric approach, also eliminating the notion of process. Furthermore, the concept of license is problematic because it's not rooted in law. Just to mention it, another interesting notion is the free, prior, and informed consent, which is result and community focused, anchored in law, and currently evolving towards a free, prior, and informed consultation, which is a more process-oriented approach. So my first recommendation would be to be aware of these debates when we engage with external stakeholders, and keep in mind that these notions are not accepted by everybody and still criticized. When it comes to a project, the two main questions that are raised by stakeholders are, first, is the project legitimate in its environment and in the current context, being the need to mitigate climate change and transform our energy systems? Clearly, geothermal as a renewable and clean source of energy has its role to play. But second, are the project implementation conditions acceptable? This is really an important question for project stakeholders usually. So these two questions have to be debated with stakeholders, and to some extent, the answers to these questions should be co-constructed with them through what we call stakeholder engagement processes. So in conclusion, I'm not sure that geothermal has a social license. Conditions might be more favorable than oil and gas projects, or maybe CCS project too, but nothing is granted a priori. Social license has to be gained and preserved all along the project lifetime.
Thanks. And so social license is about people, right? And so maybe if I can switch over to you, Neil, and just ask you, what are the biggest challenges that locals and communities face? And how can geothermal provide solutions to some of those challenges?
Well, thanks, Andy. I mean, the point to it, and I think Laurent was making some excellent points there, and building on that, really, social license is one term, but it's a diverse group of people. I mean, the local communities themselves, there's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge in working with local people around big developments. And I'd point to things like the timber extraction industries, even before oil and gas. Now, we know within geothermal, we've got, as you rightly say, this permission almost, because it's a green energy and on paper it looks good. The challenges are in all of these things is once you start to implement them, then you've got to keep everybody honest and transparent with what was said. And primarily, if you throw open that open transparency, then people can question you. You've got to be prepared to take those questions. And often the reality is people around in those stakeholders don't want that dialogue opened up as much. And that is a challenge, because what's good for local communities isn't necessarily good for the business because it can be expensive. It might not be good for, let's say, the major stakeholders, because their drive might be slightly different. So buy-in to being a socially acceptable and open, transparent business is absolutely key. And that's led from the top of every organization. But we also have to accept that not every organization is not like that. And the costs involved with doing things like good ESG, environmental social governance work, can be high and underestimated.
Thanks, Neil. And so you talk to a conflict between good engagement, stakeholder engagement, and good business, and that there's a tension between the two. And I wonder, is that perceived and real? And I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts about that maybe it's good business to do good stakeholder engagement. Would anyone like to answer that? Bruce?
Well, yeah, I think that absolutely yes. I think it's essential, and as some of my comments will sort of indicate, geothermal everywhere is sort of the new paradigm that people are thinking about. And as geothermal advances into new regions, more, the affected communities will be greenfields, as they would say in oil and gas speak. They've never seen drill rigs, so I think that there's a few different pieces to this. One is sort of broad social acceptance, which will help lead to community acceptance. But I think that it's really very good business in terms of developing geothermal in a way that it spreads globally beyond where it is today in hydrothermal areas. This is going to be an essential piece of it.
Thanks, Bruce. And I think if we think about geothermal projects, we're looking at 30, 50-year developments. And we're moving into people's neighborhoods. It's like moving into someone's backyard. And how being good neighbors often means that you have a better, more successful outcomes. So maybe I turn to you, Allyson, and think about and want to hear your views on how do we build relationships and trust with local communities?
Yeah, so I should say I'm going to represent a broad field of view from what I picked up from working in this area for about 20 years. Is first, when you think about building trust with communities, we've got to think, to your point, about what if we lived in that community, like what would we find acceptable and allowing in our backyard? How would we want that to operate? Because somebody had asked me a question about something years ago, would you want this in your backyard? And I said, yeah, if I was able to help dictate the terms and say, I want a fence here and actually have some input in the process, I would be more than happy to have energy development in my backyard, right? It's about a conversation. So it's like, first, let's respect ourselves, think about what we'd want from our neighbors and what we expect. The second thing is listen and discuss. Okay. And that's not just the lip service. Like, people want to feel heard. And that means actually having a dialogue. And sometimes the people in the community ask for something and it's actually a pretty easy thing to do, but you wouldn't know unless you asked that question in the first place. There's putting up a sound barrier when you're doing something that's got a generator, or it's, while you're at it, could you make it look better when it's done, right? Have a community development project. So there's a lot of things you can do. So those are the first two things. I'd say the third thing is to always remember that we're working and playing oftentimes in the same community as where the project is, right? And so from the perspective of Baker Hughes, as we've got a part of what we do on the services side with geothermal. And so a lot of the people might actually be in the communities where they live, that they're doing the work. And there's there's the community sense of pride around having local jobs. And sometimes that's the best connection point in establishing a common framework to bring stakeholders together, is to remember that everybody's in it together, both the project developer and the people in the community. So those are the big three things. And I'd say last thing, own the dialogue, just own it. I said it last year, there's good and bad and everything in between when we look at developing anything. Right. And so we just got to own it and have a real dialogue and a really respectful exchange.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Allyson, talking about not being afraid to talk about failures and being open and honest. That's how you build trust, and that we're all people, we all live in a community. And sometimes we're just wearing different labels in a community. That's really interesting. Lauren, maybe I can shoot back to you. You had some really good thoughts about, involving communities and how to get them involved in projects so that they drive successful outcomes.
Yeah, in fact, maybe we should go a little bit further than simply dialogue. In fact, I'm convinced that we can also work, with external stakeholders, not on all topics of interest, of course, but on topics which are of concern for them. And I'm sure that when it comes, for instance, to social and environmental impacts, we should not only talk to them about these impacts, but also try to define together the mitigation actions that have to be implemented. And I believe that through these very active engagement practices, we will create the most favorable conditions for the realization of a project, because again, we give an active role to the stakeholders.
Thank you. Bruce?
I think there's another piece of this that is really important, and that is probably because I live in a rural area, and I see geothermal as a decarbonization solution. And we need to recognize in this process the communities are not monolithic. If we learn anything about social license from shale gas and the development in the Pennsylvania, US Marcellus Shale, is that it pitted neighbor versus neighbor. It created winners and losers. Relative to sort of the more environmental side, not all stakeholders will be moved by decarbonization. For some, it will be about jobs. And it would be really easy for industry to run with this sediment, but it could doom broad approval. So there really needs to be a balance, and industry needs to come in and really listen to both sides and all sides viewpoints, and recognize that there are those. In the case of the Marcellus, it was a mineral rights conflict. I would say that individuals hold surface and sometimes subsurface mineral rights, and to use I guess an old term, but landmen showed up and started paying for lease and mineral rights, and there were winners and losers. Early people got paid less, and later ones got paid more, and some people held out, and then there's places where it's potentially where the oil and gas companies drilled underneath people's homes, so there's, that's one of the advantages or disadvantages, I guess, socially, of directional drilling. So I think that, communities are not one thing. And I think we've learned that more and more in the past, 3 or 4 years, particularly in the United States. So I think that, the industry should ensure that community members will benefit fairly from the energy source. And for that kind of cries out for industry engagement best practices.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. And I think, that talks to, we're talking to groups of people from diverse groups of people from in the complex local environments, but surely some of these solutions are simple when we think about, how we respect and talk to people. And we do have to be careful about good intentions leading to unintended consequences. So maybe, Neil, would you like to add to that? Okay. Thanks, Bruce. Neil, would you like to carry on?
Yes, I mean, really on from what Bruce was saying is that fact that communities are different. There's no question at all, and situations change. And one of the things that's come out over the years is the dependence almost, or the insistence on environmental impact assessments. And in my world of conservation, they've been downgraded in terms of their relevance only because it's a snapshot. And a snapshot, it changes. And my question around any big development is you can say the right things at the right time. When you implement it, you've got to live what you've said. And there are sometimes a lot of costs involved. And then people can start to backpedal. You shouldn't underestimate the costs of true community engagement. You shouldn't underestimate the difficulties that's associated with it. So in terms of process, it is, as like Allyson was saying, about participation. Make sure that the people are represented. But more than that, of everything else, you have to have buy-in from the very top. This is the approach that you want to take. If you don't have that, if it's whitewashing, if it's just to make money, it's going to crash and burn.
Okay, so just going back to what I just said, that was keeping our companies and our industry engaged in social engagement and stakeholder engagement in a positive way. Should we be using carrots or sticks or both? Does anyone have an opinion on that? Neil?
Well, I've said this before, I mean, carrots and sticks is an expression that we've used for many years because we recognize that law enforcement on its own and prevention is not going to work. And it's true of everybody. It's just a human trait. If somebody tells you to do something, your natural reaction is, well, do I have to do that? But converse to that, you've got the pure incentive schemes. And the trouble with pure incentives is the fact that it often doesn't address the problem in the first instance. Around the environmental world, this is the real challenge. So there's a paradigm of the three-legged stool here, which is you have to have this control, this law enforcement, this respect the rules as one of the aspects. You have to have alternatives to existing behavior, that it could be destructive. But thirdly, it is local ownership of where the sense of direction goes. So you can go in, do a project and leave it, but leave that capacity with the local people to take it on in the direction that you want to achieve things.
Thanks, Neil. Allyson?
Yeah, so, the carrot and stick question is a good one. I think oftentimes there's always this it's kind of a rush for people to say, oh, if they're not doing it well, it's like let's go to the stick right away. But oftentimes when you mandate things in the space, it becomes very checklisty and pro forma, right? And then the engagement isn't a very earnest or authentic dialogue, right? And for like real community engagement to work and be successful, everybody needs to see that we are coming together in an authentic place, right? So otherwise, it's who would you trust, right? So a thing I'd like to go back to is when you get into that dialogue. Sometimes when you first come into a community, you might be so new that you're not known, and so maybe you're freshly moving in and you don't have people in the same community. And so it's worth actually oftentimes pulling in a third party who's viewed as neutral and unbiased to help start that engagement. I don't think we've talked about that yet. And this is something that I've watched several groups here in the United States do with some great success. And I'd like to give an example. The Keystone Policy Center does this work in Colorado with the indigenous tribal communities that are still there when energy projects come in to their area, and it's been very successful at brokering dialogue. And and in that way, they're well respected, and any of the partners that they pull in are able to come and have a really nice measured conversation. And it's not one side gets everything. People have to compromise sometimes around what they'd like to do in their energy projects. But I think it's a really good way for first entry to talk about. And then something we haven't talked about that I want to make sure that I squeeze in here is oftentimes we only think about social license on the front end, and we forget that there's a very, very, very important back end. And so that's if you are then leaving a community at the end of a project lifespan. And with geothermal, we have some really old projects that have been out on the books for a long time. But as that landscape changes and we have some that sort of ebb and flow more in new areas, how companies leave the community behind will become very important for them having social license in the next community that they get into. Reputation does matter. And so I would appeal to everybody here is you think about this, you should design from the start, thinking about what's the lifespan, how you want to engage and keep that partnership, and knowing that you might leave the community and you want to leave it a good place, better than you found it, so to speak.
Thanks, Allyson. And I think you bring up a good point, is that when people do this badly, we all carry the burden of that as an industry, and we all have to work harder to build trust out there in the community. And I wonder what are the roles that peers need to play in monitoring poor behavior in this space? Do we, how do we hold others to account and hold their feet to the fire, so to say? Do you have an opinion on that, Allyson?
Yeah, I've seen notable examples, and everybody can probably pull up their favorite example. I mean, whether you look at the energy industry or you look in other places, like let's use, for instance, like the Volkswagen scandal, right? Around how they had their emissions and such. don't think for a minute that their peer group wasn't pretty mad that they had violated the public trust as well, right? And not actively disclosing, because then it throws suspect view on all of the other automobile manufacturers in the sector. And so it's important to realize that just one bad actor casts a negative pallor on everybody else. And so there is a really big peer social license that I think comes into play here. I'd be interested to hear what the other people thought about that.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Yeah, Neil?
Well, Alison makes a great point. I mean, I would point to the timber extraction industries as one that was, as you have really strong players who are doing the right thing, and you've got others who aren't. The trouble is it taints the whole industry. And I would look, if we look at the role of IGA in this, and there's no question that in my limited experience of IGA, you've got a group of people who are supporting your membership and you're saying the right things. There's no question. It's when you've got the bad players in there who are saying, I'm doing this without thinking the long term. I'm thinking for the short term, I'm going to get in and get out. How do you do that as a trade association? How do you get those tenders written such that the fact that the members have to sign up to those criteria which you want them to adhere to? And those are challenges for your industry. You as you rightly said in the video you showed before, you have got a good social license. This is a green industry. We all want it to succeed, but you start from a position of strength, and the difficulty is maintaining that position.
And that's a really good point, Neil. And I think we've all been asking ourselves that question, seeing the big companies from oil and gas moving into geothermal. How do we make sure that we keep our culture and the way that we operate and maintain that, and allow these big companies to participate in a way that we deem is right, or the right way to do things? So does anyone else? Bruce, you raised your hand there for a second.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts along some of the lines. I'm thinking sort of bigger. I'm thinking about where geothermal goes over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. And I'm not sure, if anyone has control over that, whether it's today's geothermal industry or big oil or a combination, or maybe it's big tech working with both. But I think that at the most basic level, that there needs to be a broad societal vision for next generation geothermal systems. And I don't think that can happen just by the industry alone. I think that there's a message that surrogates and supporters that are from broad, different, different kinds of, interests should be speaking for this vision, and the vision of, say, zero carbon energy anywhere. It's local, it's competitive and affordable, and can provide energy security. There's lots of great value propositions there. And I think that as we go forward, if geothermal is going to spread as a decarbonization solution, that this message needs to precede all of what we're talking about as we scale up from hydrothermal systems to hot dry rock systems and other systems. So I think building credibility through surrogates is really important, but also I think in carbon capture, I think is got a really good analogy where we've worked together for common goals. So there's a carbon capture coalition, which is a broad coalition, and it's been working to build, supporting incentives and things like that, and we've come up with the 45Q, which is a tax incentive, and there's feed-in tariffs in the EU and so forth. And I think that it's a good exercise to bring people in and work towards a goal so that we can have broad geothermal success. I don't think we should focus on one area or another. There's a number of different areas that are starting to expand, whether it be engineered systems or enhanced systems different kinds of heating systems and supercritical systems and sedimentary systems. We don't want to pick winners. We just need to have a vision for how it could all come together and decarbonize the planet.
Thanks, Bruce. And I think that's really important. And I think we find all of our communities around the world in the geothermal industry speaking about how do we talk about geothermal and how we value everything that geothermal has to offer, and talking to our communities about it in a meaningful way so that others outside of ourselves who sit there and say geothermal's awesome can understand the awesomeness of geothermal and how it can transform communities and groups of people, and how do we do that better. And I think that's something that the IGA, we're focused on really heavily at the moment, about sharing that messaging across the world, instead of speaking about how geothermal can be a substitute for other generation types, but what geothermal can add that's more than. And I think that's a really important conversation that we carry on. What I'd really like to do is you talk to this a little bit, Allyson, but I'll ask you, Laurent, to talk about what are some really good examples and models of social license and stakeholder engagement that you know about around the world. Doesn't have to be from this industry, but who are the people that are doing this really well, and what does really well look like?
I think we are beginners, you know, in most cases, and very often we have to face difficulties. So I think there is a lot, you know, in terms of progresses. So I would not give gold medals like that. Huh? I'd like still to make a point, you know, the issue we have, in fact, it's much wider than geothermal. I think that what we really have to do is to convince the civil society stakeholders that resources and uses of the subsurface have a role to play in the transformation of our energy systems, to avoid a systematic opposition in the realization of projects, because that's a big issue which is which is not limited to geothermal, unfortunately, and this is also linked to the way laymen represent themselves, the subsurface. You know, it's we have our own objective representations as scientists and technicians, but it is not like that. You know, that common people figure, you know, what the subsurface is, and we have really to help them better understand not only the technologies, but also the medium itself, the differences in scales and so on. Otherwise, they will always keep a very strong imaginary component in their representation, and dialogue will not be possible, especially when it comes to risk. So coming to your question, I think that definitely a thorough stakeholder engagement process is absolutely mandatory, and for me, it starts with a very thorough analysis of the project context, the project stakeholders, the different issues and concerns that these stakeholders may have with the project. So a lot of companies do that. Stakeholder analysis is a common practice, but very often they don't know what to do with it. So all the goal beyond that is really to define a stakeholder engagement strategy from your stakeholder analysis and your context analysis. And first of all, what you have to establish is the conditions of an informed dialogue on the legitimacy, the raison d'être of a project in a specific territory. And we talk a lot about geothermal, but there are different kinds of geothermal, and the benefits of these different kinds of geothermal projects are different also. They may be more or less local, and we have to take all that into account. And when the legitimacy of a project is established, the discussion for me should move to the project implementation conditions, with, of course, a very strong focus on impacts and risk. You may know that in France we had a very big failure on implementing enhanced geothermal systems, and we had to stop a project because it triggered an earthquake, several earthquakes of magnitude higher than 3. And it's very likely that all the sector now will have difficulties to restart. So project options, actions to mitigate risk have to be debated, but not only debated, they have to be discussed, and solutions should be found with the involvement of project stakeholders, and they should be part of decision-making processes. My point is that the more active the stakeholders are in the process of carrying on a project, the more favorable the conditions for its realization will be.
Thanks, Laurent. Allyson.
Yeah, I like that parting shot, Laurent. It's good. It's like the more, so oftentimes we think about the activist sort of community person who goes in the direction you don't want them to go, gets really excited and takes the project down. But I think companies need to maybe not fear that, and yet kind of embrace the role of the active public, right? Because it's sort of, I don't want to, maybe it sounds weird if you can't beat them, join them, like joining forces together to say tackling things with a really enthusiastic leader is a really good way of really having good alliance. Like, you know, Andy, you raised the question of like who's done it right. So I want to start with one example, which is the not good, and then show you the better and best. Okay, so the first example I can think of is actually in early days. I may have mentioned this last year, but if people are coming back and didn't get to hear some of this last year, there was a project in the early days of the Department of Energy's carbon capture and storage phase 1. Like very early research projects on the storage side, and it was slated for Ohio, a small community. One stakeholder, one engaged active guy took the whole thing down. I mean, it made newspapers outside of Ohio. It was a very big deal. And so, you know, there's kind of this idea that as you're coming in and doing something new in a community for the first time, you know, it's like companies have to think like, do we go in and engage before we go, or do we do it as we go? So you have to think about sequencing and timing, because if it's something new, I think it can come across as a little bit scary. But the thing to think about is the future of the expanded geothermal. And I can't remember who said it, Bruce or someone, that's talking a little bit more on the tech side, right? So technology for some people captivates. For some people, it's a little spooky, right? But what we can all agree to is that if you take someone and walk them around what the technology is going to do, and actually kind of expose it for what it is, and how it will lead to clean energy production in this case, you know, there's a lot of deep and trusting engagement that can come off of that. And so the good example that I'll talk to you about is where companies would actually take people to their site and walk them around and let them actually kind of participate in a way in the activities of the day. And in one case, I did see, I should tell everybody, I did work for a US senator. And so I saw a lot of these public engagement activities. And so this was a mining company that I'm thinking of. I'm not going to say who it is because that's like too much shameless promotion in one round. But this company really wanted the community to understand how they were shifting away from one kind of mining into another. And the solution was a technological solution. So they brought in members of the community in small groups to come and participate. And in one case, because there was some autonomous drilling capabilities, where some remote operations, let some of the people do a mock simulation and actually steer that piece of machinery, right? It was risk-free and a VR space. But I thought that was a really fantastic example, and people walked away kind of feeling excited about it, that this new solution was being brought to their community. Okay, so I think that there are some ways that we hadn't talked about where you can use technology to really illustrate how you're moving energy forward in a new, safer, cleaner, more sustainable way.
Great, thanks, Allyson. I think that's really some really good highlights there. We might have to move on to the questions now. We've got some questions from the crowd, which I'm really excited to bring to the panel. I think one of the questions that we see in there that I think is a really good one, what about the opportunities in the relationship with local community? Isn't there something to be gained here instead of just managed? And when I think about that, I think about in New Zealand, our Indigenous peoples are Māori, and they have what's called mātauranga Māori, which is Indigenous knowledge systems. And I think about how when we from the industry go and do projects into Indigenous communities, and we have this bias around superior science and knowledge, and we're here to tell you how to do it better, or we know how to do it better. And we all know in geothermal, there are complex scientific problems to be solved. And we know that complex problems require robust discussions and looking at things differently. And when we look at other people's lenses, if we opened our mind to think about things a bit differently and thought, perhaps we put aside this bias around superiority from Western science, and we think, maybe they've got a point. Maybe they have some ideas about how to do this better. What if we put that aside? I'm sure we would come out with much stronger outcomes and better solutions and pathways. Does anyone else want to add about, thinking from a community perspective? What are the opportunities as opposed to managing local communities? Neil.
Well, it's interesting you put it very well, Andy, that this top-down approach, we sort of filtered it out in the world of biodiversity conservation, because it's not about education. And in fact, we dropped the word education, 15 odd years ago, because it's about engagement. Education to best, I'm giving you the knowledge. And in fact, as you say, it's a two-way street. I think what you could look at, and it's probably relevant to geothermal industry in itself, is you're often into places which are quite disadvantaged, quite rural, and where these have got big impacts. These whole projects have got impacts on that community. That in itself is going to be a game changer for the people there. And it's absolutely crucial, as we've all said, I think, that the impact and the ways to bring that opportunity to the local community is devised by the local community themselves. They have to own those things around. So that's absolutely, it's a very good point about, it's not about managing, it's actually empowering people to do them. And it's a two-way street, what works and what doesn't work. There isn't one answer to everything.
Thanks, Neil. Does anybody else want to make any comments on that before we move on to the next question? Okay. So I think this is a good question. Historically, without standards, and this talks to your earlier point, Neil, social license to operate approaches and energy ventures become competitive between companies and eventually land in the lap of regulators to standardize and define. What are the panel's thoughts on how this will evolve? Would anyone like to have a go at that? Bruce?
Well, I'd like to say how it could evolve. We worked with a group of companies in Pennsylvania on the Marcellus Shale for about 6 years, developing best practices, because there was, the industry, oil and gas industry, was just dug in that they were not going to accept any kind of regulations that were protective. Yet, I think that as we move forward with geothermal expanding into new areas, there's going to have to be a regulatory construct that gives people in communities assurance that it's going to be operated safely. So I think that, I think industry can get ahead of this by bringing in stakeholders and having building a dialogue towards how to both conduct community engagement, to use Neil's word, but also how to address actual potential problems in communities. Drill rigs in their backyards, encampments, heavy trucking, noise from rotor drilling, compressors, rig roads, and road design. I mean, there's so much to it. There's surface groundwater risk. There's quite a bit of work in the US and probably elsewhere on groundwater protection. Some of those regulations could easily be modified. And there's induced seismicity. And I think all of those things can be addressed well in advance of the expansion of some of the new, sort of next generation geothermal technologies.
Thanks, Bruce. Neil?
Yeah, sorry, quickly, I think it's a really great question, because what you're in as an industry, you need this level playing field, and this is what other big industries have suffered from. They're not a level playing field, that people take shortcuts, and then you get these where you have the regulators have to come in to say, wait a minute, this is not what we planned. How you do that, I think it's a challenge for the industry as a whole. I think you've got the enthusiasm and certainly the social license right now to say, this is what we want to do as an industry. We want to be the cleanest, greenest, most sustainable industry that's out there that supports development. And it's for you guys to come up with solutions, how you regulate your members, etc. in the nicest
I think
possible.
that's really important. Thank you. Thanks, Neil. Allyson.
I think it's worth noting a couple of things about the difference between, because like Bruce brought up oil and gas and kind of how he said that they fought regulations with the Marcellus. I actually was on the receiving end of that. I was still working in Congress at the time. And there actually was a whole consortia with oil and gas at the heart that was trying to find consensus around a model framework that was looking pretty good. And so I wouldn't say that's universal. And I would say that's what's different from geothermal, is that with oil and gas, how a lot of the alliances are built where peers hold each other accountable happens in different trade groups, right? And there's a lot of them, and it's a really active space. And when you look at geothermal, there's really only two or three, okay? And so you've got IGA, and you have in the US Geothermal Rising, and it's very unified, okay? And so while many actors may have they'd like to tweak it this way, how they're approaching things is with a one geothermal voice. And so it's just worth noting that in all the other energy sectors, I wouldn't say that they're quite as unified in their thinking, and you get a big range of diverse voices. Geothermal, I've always been impressed by how they come together and think about driving operational excellence with the other companies in the sector, because it's so small, right? And that's I would say that's universal around the world. And I think it's a really point of distinction that is different.
I feel the same way. I mean, there are benefits from being a small group. We're really well connected and we share similar values. And that's really interesting, because it points to that, how do we keep that shared voice as we grow? And there is perceived tensions between oil and gas and geothermal people. And there's this feeling of, there's superiority coming from oil and gas storming into geothermal, and how do we keep ourselves, and we're the minnows. And it's interesting, because how do we have conversations and move forward? How do we create a new culture that we come together and take advantage of some of those learnings? I think, what can we learn from oil and gas around stakeholder engagement, which is a weird way to say it. With this whole conversation, we've been saying, what can oil and gas learn from geothermal? But I'm sure there's stories and learnings that we can take. There's lots of money and thinking and investment in this space, and there are really smart people in oil and gas that we perhaps could learn from in this space. And I'd really like to see more conversations going on about this perhaps. What I might do is I might move now. We're getting close to the end of our little panel. Great discussion we've had today. I think it's a discussion that's being held more widely and we need more of. Perhaps I'd like to just move around to each of you and ask you to sum up your thoughts and tell us what you think about, after our discussion today, is important to leave with our audience. Laurent, I might start with you and go from there.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, for me, what I would like to stress is that the main challenge we have in the implementation of project is really to engage external stakeholders in the process of implementing a project, deciding first on the project and then implementing the project itself. but privileging the most participative modes, at least for the dimensions which concern the most, such as the management or the addressment of social and environmental impacts. And the most participative modes are collaborations, and I think that Neil talked about also empowerment, and I think this is what we talk about, and not just communication or consultation, even not just involvement. And we should not fear these forms of engagement, because in fact, classical theories of social psychology, especially the commitment theory, assure us that this is how we can create the most favorable conditions for the implementation of project. Even if, of course, this is very much against company cultures, sometimes, because they are not used to work with the external world. But we have really to accept doing that and develop these capabilities.
Great, thanks. Now I'll pass over to Neil.
Well, that's an excellent point by Laurent, and sort of what I've taken from this and the input from these expert panel really is the fact that for me the challenges around the geothermal industry are about keeping those standards high. What Bruce was alluding to there was really about on oil and gas and the industry growing. You've got a macro environment right now where everybody is in support of green energy. We have the COP26 taking place later this year. We know we've got these massive targets that every country is trying to hit with their nationally determined contributions to lower greenhouse gases. Your industry is very well primed. My fear for it is that once it opens up and more these bigger players come in, that you are going to get undercut in terms of your standards, because it's a business. And business can drive things downwards unless you have, as somebody's talking about, rules and regulations. But how you regulate that is a challenge for the industry, I think.
Thanks, Neil. Appreciate those comments. Bruce.
Well, I guess I'm thinking big still, and I think that geothermal can be transformational. I mean, it really is not part of the decarbonization debate. And right now, commercial geothermal systems, if I have the number right, in 2018 were around 15 or 16 gigawatts globally. So it's a fairly small niche industry, but there's a huge upside. And I think that that scaling up means having a vision, and social license will depend on that vision, and that vision of how geothermal can transform energy systems to be zero carbon, and to be to be able to address energy development in developing worlds, in places where they don't have fossil fuels, and to address the problems of intermittency. So I mean, there's a lot of different ways to talk about this, but I think that geothermal energy can really scale across the globe. And I think that instead of, I think it's natural to think if you're part of a smaller industry like geothermal and you're looking at big oil, that's kind of scary. But I really think that geothermal can be the best of the geothermal industry today, the oil and gas industry, like utility industry, fuels, potentially hydrogen could be created from geothermal. I think there's a lot of upside, but I think that the social license, even locally, will depend on having a vision of how geothermal can move into the future and answer our energy problems in developing world, as well as the decarbonization of fossil fuels.
Thanks, Bruce. And I just want to move over to you, Allyson, for your final thoughts.
So I have several. I'm gonna try to be very brass tacks here to get through a couple. So, this isn't the panel where we talked about the global energy demands and getting to net zero, but I do want to put this all back into context as to why this is so important. So, you know, the IEA came out at some point in the last year and stated that like the bulk of the technology that's needed to get the world to a zero carbon equivalent state hasn't really been developed yet, right? When you think about that. But I would make the case that in every IEA scenario, geothermal is a tiny little thing in there, and that needs to change, okay? And so we should get very excited about the fact that geothermal is having a moment, right? But as we do that, here's the cautionary bit, okay? That we've got a lot to lose in the pivot. And so the name of the conference is called Pivot for a reason, because last year, Jamie had some great wisdom to see that the way the world is going, people are thinking about how to pivot into geothermal in a bigger way. So that means there's going to be a lot of people. I saw this last year, and I continue to see a lot of startups happening in the geothermal space. And I am here as a big cheerleader for everybody, you know, coming from where I sit at Baker Hughes. We're very focused on geothermal technology. Okay, we want to see it be very successful. Okay, but we got to get it right from the start. So if you're new and you're pivoting into the space, think about how geothermal is so necessary for society to get to that low carbon state. So do it right from the start, engage early. If you don't maybe know the right people to connect in a community, I'm sure you'd call Andy. She is a wizard and can help. And any of the people on this panel, we'd all be happy to help you find the right kinds of connections to start framing how to come into communities in a really deep and meaningful way. That means long-lasting partnership built on trust. So we can really get to that low carbon state by 2050.
Thanks, Allyson. And so social license is about building strong relationships and being good partners and neighbors in people's neighborhoods and communities. And I think some of the key messages we've heard is don't fear engagement. And I think you made a good point, Lauren, about, you know, people who are well engaged really fight for good, successful projects. I think Allyson, your conversation about we should be talking to geothermal about the value of geothermal and the fact that this is our opportunity to not just sit there and say, we're low carbon, look at all the bad guys. We should be actually showing some leadership and saying, let's get to zero, let's get to negative, and we should be taking everyone with us. And geothermal does provide more than just energy, electricity. It has some of the solutions to some of the world's biggest problems around access to water, around environment, creating food opportunities to grow and prosper, economic development for Indigenous communities. There's so much more, and we need to talk about it in a more meaningful way. I think that geothermal can be transformational, but we can only do that with people and communities. And so this discussion needs to continue, and let's, instead of thinking we have all the answers, let's open our ears and listen to some more solutions. So I'd just like to wrap up now and say thanks to our panelists for an enjoyable and thought-provoking discussion. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Jamie Beard for once again smashing out of the park an amazing event where you're giving us the opportunity to talk about the hard stuff and the interesting stuff and really important stuff for our industry moving forward. You're a real powerhouse. We appreciate you all listening out there in the world. It's been a rough year for all of us, and some still continue to have tough times, but we need every single one of you to help power our industry forward. So please take care out there. And I'd just like to close and say, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā katoa. Take care. Thank you.